You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 29th of January 2025 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UVS. Live from London, this is The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. A very warm welcome to today's programme. Coming up,
the reason for this is to ensure that every penny that is going out the door is not conflicting with the executive orders and actions that this president has taken.
What shape will America's government take under Donald Trump? A legal fight begins as grants, loans and federal funds are frozen, but judges block the order. Monocle senior news editor Chris Cermak will join me in the studio to examine the sweeping changes on the cards. Also ahead,
knowing that there was that much variability within the United States on what people even thought a Christian nation was, we couldn't then ask that sort of question across 30 plus countries and hope to have things comparable.
The rise of religious nationalism will explore what it means and how it affects the way politics is run. We'll be in the Norwegian city of Tromsø for the Arctic Frontiers Conference and hear why Chinese Lunar New Year are making tourists wary of Thailand. Plus, our editorial director Tyler Brûlé will join me in the studio. That's all coming up on The Globalist, live from London. First, a quick look at what else is happening in today's news. The Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni has been placed under investigation after a Libyan citizen wanted for war crimes was released. NATO's Secretary General Mark Rutte has urged members to strengthen its defences in the Arctic. And 10 months after its long-delayed first subsonic flight, Boom Supersonic's prototype test plane, the XB-1, has broken the sound barrier. Stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on these stories. But can Donald Trump really order a freeze on government grants and loans? If the number of states rushing to take legal action against yesterday's announcement is anything to go by, there will be quite a few challenges. A 2-page memo leaked to the press instructed agencies temporarily to pause all activities related to obligations or disbursement of all federal financial assistance. Well, moments before the ban was due to effect, a federal judge in the District of Columbia blocked it. To bring us the latest and unpick everything that's gone on in the last 12 hours, I'm joined in the studio by Monocle's senior news editor Chris Cermak. Good morning, Chris.
Good morning.
And on the line, Natasha Linstead, Professor of Government at the University of Essex, and she joins me on the line too. Good morning, Natasha.
Good morning.
Chris, let's begin with you. This was an order that was leaked almost immediately before it was due to take effect, and it took absolutely everyone by surprise.
It took everyone by surprise, and I think for context, what's interesting to me about this is that if you look at the first couple of weeks of Donald Trump's administration, everything until this point, whatever you might think of what had been done, felt relatively planned, felt relatively organized in terms of that they had a plan of what they wanted to do. There was a clear decision, sweeping plan that was being put into action by lots of members of the administration. You can question the pageantry, the effectiveness of it and all of that, but the direction and plan was clear until yesterday. And yesterday felt like the first sort of really chaotic day of the administration because you had this 2-page memo that came out and really none of the agencies understood exactly what it meant and just how sweeping it was. And that was really the key here. Was this a complete freeze on all federal funding? The only thing that the administration had tried to make clear initially was that it would not be a freeze on funding for individual people. So if you were getting money directly from the federal government, your Social Security checks, Medicare, things like that, that would continue. But of course, there's lots of programs that go via some other group that then go to individuals, and those are being halted. Housing assistance was being halted. Preschool funding was being halted. All these different programs were being halted or potentially halted because people just did not understand the breadth. And this was something that then had to be slowly corrected throughout the day, but didn't really help. It was just an incredibly chaotic day. And that was something that we hadn't really seen before.
Natasha, do we now have a clearer idea of what this freeze on government grants and loans means?
No, we don't, because as Chris mentioned, the wording was very, very unclear. What the Trump administration has said is that they are trying to ensure that all of the programs are completely aligned with Trump's agenda. And that means that they need to find programs that are supporting, and this is in their words, a woke gender ideology or transgenderism, or supporting diversity, equity, and inclusion, or supporting a Marxist equity program, or the Green New Deal. So they're trying to isolate or find out where are these types of programs, and they're saying that any programs that are aligned with that will not be supported. And so that's why there has been all this confusion, because you also have something, as Chris mentioned, like the Medicaid program. I mean, this is where this is healthcare support for more impoverished Americans, but the payments were down. And that program, I'm not sure how that program is one that would have been targeted. But you also have infrastructure programs. I mean, there are programs to improve the Golden Gate Bridge. That program was halted, and any of the governors, they receive, billions in aid from the federal government. The governors were citing that a lot of these federal aid support that they get from the government was not available. So it was completely confusing.
And just staying with you, Natasha, the big question is this actually legal? Can Trump do this?
So it's supposed to be Congress that has the power to set the budget. And this is another instance where Trump is flexing as much executive power as he can and trying to see if he can get away with it. And this happened during the first term as well, but I think we're going to see this happening again and again, where we think that we have a norm, we think we have a law, we think we have a norm, and then he presses against it, and then a judge will rule or side with them. I mean, I think probably the most monumental case was the July 1st decision by the Supreme Court, which basically said that any sitting president, is immune from whatever he wants to do. Given that was such a departure from the rule of law and traditional interpretations of the rule of law, I don't know how far he can go with it. He is definitely creating confusion along the way, enriching himself, and I'm not sure how much pushback that there's going to be. That might be, if there's more political pushback, I see that as more potentially a problem than counting on judges to be able to prevent him from doing what he wants to do.
Well, we have had, Chris, one judge already who got their act together incredibly quickly. We had a federal judge in the District of Columbia blocked this freeze. There was an enormous reaction to this announcement yesterday, wasn't there?
Well, yes, and so this judge blocked the freeze only until the 3rd of February, essentially allowing those state officials and others to get their own challenges in for a more proper look at this and maybe a longer injunction, if you will. I would say to Natasha's point there, Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, the Republican Speaker of the House, did call this an appropriate use of executive authority. So there are going to be questions, if you will, on whether there is political pushback that also comes, and that's sort of my question, from Republican circles as well, and conservatives, on whether this is some form of executive overreach. If it's just Democrats that are doing it, that's not going to be enough to check Donald Trump on this.
Natasha, a moment ago you talked about how Trump and what he's doing, and you also said as well, Chris, about the speed at which he's working, this creation of confusion. There is this strategy, isn't there, called Flood the Zone, which he did in 2018, and it's being described this morning. The New York Times has an excellent explainer on it, saying it's a deliberate effort by the president, his team, to roll out an unceasing flow of initiatives that completely knocks everybody off balance. Natasha, what is the effect of something like that?
Well, it's going to make it very difficult for the U.S. to be governed it's ungovernable at the moment if all these programs are either halted or there's confusion or you can't pay people. I mean, Chris listed it, but there's so many programs were affected: housing, school lunches, healthcare, education, anti-poverty programs, cancer research. So this means that people are so disoriented and just trying to fight so many different battles that it will become much more difficult for anyone to receive the normal things that government is supposed to do. I mean, we actually thought that because he created this agency, it's not really an agency, but an organization called DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, which is, I guess, not technically part of the cabinet, led by Elon Musk, that the recommendations for cutting the government were going to become were going to come in July of 2026, not literally in January of 2025. So he sort of has unsettled, shocked, completely caught everyone off their footing. And by doing so, no one really can fight this effectively.
And Chris, we now have, in addition to this announcement about a freeze on loans and payments, 2 million federal workers have been offered a payout to resign. And the line is that enhanced standards will ensure that the remaining workers are trustworthy. What does that mean? Is this now Trump forming a government internally which adheres to his principles and his standards only?
So this is the other aspect of this where Donald Trump has moved and his administration with really lightning speed. We had already seen that he had specifically rolled back any efforts to promote diversity within the federal government, saying that those employees who had benefited from diversity programs should be diversity equity programs should be let go immediately. And this is now the next step, that he has invited basically pretty much all federal workers to quit with full pay until September, through September, if they would like to. And this is sort of laying down the law also with, for example, the start of, you have to go in for a 5-day work week. So he's any resistance that there is basically to his agenda, he is inviting those federal workers to leave immediately. And yes, this goes exactly to both, not just the shrinking of government that he is planning, also with, as we've been talking about, this memo about stopping certain government programs or halting government programs, but shrinking the size of the people of government. And yes, also tackling this idea that he has, of course, spoken about throughout his throughout his campaign, and supporters have as well, of some kind of deep state, those people who are unsupportive of him within the federal government, the civilian workforce. He wants to get rid of them, and he only wants people who, frankly, he trusts.
Chris Cermak and Natasha Lindstedt, thank you so much for joining me on The Globalist. You're listening to Monocle Radio. Time is 8:14 in Tromsø, which is where we head next, because the Arctic Frontiers Conference has become more and more relevant in the last 3 years. Moscow's invasion of Ukraine had focused minds, with one session yesterday focusing on the Russian Arctic in wartime. And since the US President Donald Trump declared a desire to have Greenland, the attention has grown even more intense. Well, trying to keep up with it all is Lars Bevanger, who's Monocle's Oslo correspondent, who's up north in Tromsø for the conference. Good morning, Lars.
Good morning.
So what is the atmosphere like there? I mean, are we really looking at a place now whose narrative is dominated by Donald Trump?
Well, I think a lot of the organisers have been trying to avoid that, but obviously that has been one of the main talking points here. What is he actually going to do, if anything, about Greenland? And we've seen quite frantic activities among European leaders, but particularly the Nordic ones, shoring up support for the Kingdom of Denmark and Greenland. I spoke to the Norwegian foreign minister here yesterday, and he made a very clear point out of what he basically said. Number one rule in foreign affairs, foreign relations, is you respect each other's borders. He didn't mention Trump specifically, but that was clearly what he was alluding to. But there are many other issues here as well that are very important. Of course, the Arctic has, as you said, become more and more relevant because of the existence of rare earth minerals, oil and gas, and the climate change challenge, of course.
So what are the headlines? Let's move away from Donald Trump and talk about the other things that are dominating the agenda, Lars.
There's a lot of talk about the need for a green transition. Obviously, climate change is very much on the agenda, especially here in the Arctic, where it is felt much keener than elsewhere in the world. Global warming happens nearly 4 times faster up here compared to the rest of the planet. Of course, the green transition then means more green energy projects like wind farms. Now that clashes with a lot of the indigenous populations who live in the Arctic. Here in Norway and the other Nordic countries, we've got the Sami population, the reindeer herders, who are very worried about the impact on their ancestral lands and the access to these now that you've got more wind farms, more green energy projects, but also a lot more increase in military activity, because obviously Finland and Sweden are now also NATO members. So the military exercises that happen every year up here are getting bigger, and that also has an impact on nature.
Indeed, and we had a first session yesterday, didn't we, focusing on the Russian Arctic in wartime?
Yes, absolutely, and it is. We're very close to the Russian border here, and also that part of Russia is where Russia's nuclear submarine base is, and it's also air bases there that are very much operational now in the war against Ukraine. So it's keenly felt up here. People are used to being neighbors with Russia. People are used to cooperating with Russia, which is now more or less stopped since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. But it is definitely something that people are aware of up here in everyday life, and military presence is key. And we've also seen a boost in military spending. Denmark just 2 days ago announced another couple of $1 billion increase in their defense budget, which is going to be targeted on Arctic areas and particularly in and around Greenland.
With so many different pressures pushing and pulling, how strong a sense is there that the Arctic cooperates not just with its neighbours but within itself?
Well, the Arctic cooperation has always been organized through the Arctic Council, where all the 8 Arctic nations have been present. Russia is more or less out of that now because of Putin's invasion of Ukraine. So that is a big gap in that cooperation. Russia is by far the largest Arctic nation. It has nearly half of the landmass in the Arctic. Now we don't know exactly where the Trump administration is going to go, whether the cooperation with the US is going to be more difficult going forward. The US delegation that was expected to this conference has pretty much been pared down to near zero, which might be normal in a time of a new administration changeover, but still there is a lot of questions around where Arctic cooperation goes next. But there's no doubt amongst the people who are here, and the top politicians say that this is such a crucial cooperation that we cannot lose. So I think people will double down and make sure it does carry on in some shape or form.
Who are the Arctic's cheerleaders? I mean, we had the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz rallying behind the Danish Prime Minister when she was talking about Greenland a few days ago. Is there a sense that the likes of the European Union can step up here?
Yeah, absolutely, and I think the whole world should be cheerleaders of the Arctic because of all the important issues, and there are big players here as well when it comes to influence over the region because of the important economic and strategic importance of the region. We see China taking a much bigger interest now, calling itself a near Arctic nation, even though it's not an Arctic nation. They're interested in the opening of new sea routes with the ice melting faster, opening up much faster sea routes between Asia and Europe. So a lot of people will support sustainable development of the Arctic, both economically but also militarily. So it's a very important area of the world which needs to also continue in the continuing be governed by international law, and I think the European Union and all the Arctic states are going to play a very key role going forward.
Lars Bavanger, thank you so much for joining us on the line from Tromsø. Still to come on today's programme.
The Thai government prioritises the safety of tourists as a matter of utmost importance. We are committed to fostering understanding and rebuilding trust amongst our Chinese friends.
That's a Thai Prime Minister there, but the year of the snake, I should say, is already proving inauspicious for Thailand's tourism sector. Find out a little later on The Globalist.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
Just nudging 7:22 here in London. Let's continue now with today's newspapers. I'm delighted to say that joining me in the studio is Nina Dos Santos, international broadcast correspondent and the former CNN Europe editor, and a welcome voice around the table. Good morning, Nina. How is life where you are?
Good morning, Emma. Very, very good, thanks. Yeah.
Good.
Stuck between, the tax return deadline in a couple of days' time and a huge video editing project.
Excellent.
So this is a great welcome relief.
A break from the screen and an opportunity to look at some newspapers.
The screen and the scream, I'd say, actually.
Oh. So I wish you the very best of luck with all that. Tell us, while you've been sort of taking a break from all that, you've been looking at the papers for us, you've done the heavy lifting for us. What have you spotted?
Well, first thing I think is a great story is Keir Starmer writing in the Times today, this sort of big op-ed piece that they've sort of taken and had another news piece put on top as well. On the front page is that he's invoking, and get this, the irony of the Iron Lady to try and sell his policies here. So, oh dear, I'd love to hear what Neil Kinnock has to say about this. With his time in the Labour Party, having been trumped by Thatcher, in a couple of elections, Keir Starmer saying that, he wants to smash red tape across the UK. He wants to engineer the economy in a similar way that Thatcher did by deregulation. She obviously did that in the financial sector. He wants to do this, it seems, in the building sector in particular, to try and make sure that there's all sorts of impediments to building big in Britain and building, quote unquote, back better. If they can get rid of lots of red tape. But obviously, I think the patience from many readers of that article and across the UK is wearing pretty thin because growth is stuttering to a halt. It's pretty anemic. Lots of small to medium-sized businesses are saying that they're in financial distress because of Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor's really onerous budget that she announced only a few months ago.
What I find astonishing is the way that Keir Starmer is trying to sell this. And I just wouldn't mind focusing a little on the language here, that we have, for a man who is being accused of lacking dynamism, his words are getting more baroque, and so we have
baroque. That is a great word.
So we have this sort of these wild, bushy metaphors going at us today. We have thickets of red tape. Bureaucracy has spread through the economy like Japanese knotweed. Who's he trying to talk to here?
I don't know. It's really interesting that you ask that, because I think the problem is that these grandiose pronouncements, these huge amounts of jargon, and by the way, his Chancellor Rachel Reeves is very much prone to this, sort of slipping in jargon. We've been journalists for 20 odd years. My experience is when people don't talk straight, when they use a lot of jargon, the public starts to think that they might be obfuscating a bit. Now, the obvious square that they can't circle, or circle that they can't square, depending on which side you look at it from, is that the budget that they put forward was pretty draconian for many small to medium-sized businesses. It means higher taxes, yet again, for lots and lots of people across this country at a time when they don't have a huge amount of job security and the economy is stuttering to a halt. The latest GDP figures showed that there was anemic growth of just 0.1%, and it may go into reverse gear. Now, with those, and Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, has also said, by the way, that she won't relax borrowing rules as well. She wants to keep to these really stiff fiscal rules to balance the budget. The real question here is there's only so many times, a bit like Crying Wolf, they can shout that they're going to create growth. They're now 6 months into this and those pronouncements are becoming more hysterical. and it hasn't been forthcoming. And indeed, it might be extremely embarrassing if the economy goes into reverse gear.
Let's talk about Peter Mandelson, Lord Mandelson. He is on his way to being accepted as the UK ambassador to the US. The Donald Trump problem has been solved. He's been accepted by the Americans. However, the FBI has been handed a dossier on his connections to China.
Yes, so the Independent claims that it has the exclusive on Donald Trump's administration, essentially saying that they're not going to veto Peter Mandelson's candidacy as not candidacy, how would you say it? Appointment as the UK ambassador to Washington, D.C., replacing the very highly respected Karen Pierce, who's been in that job for quite some time. But in the meantime, there has been a sort of furious lobbying activity on both sides of the Atlantic against him. I know the Interparliamentary Alliance on China very well. I've followed a lot of their activity over the years. They're a grouping of sort of quite hawkish people on China, but from both sides of the aisle and from various different countries. And what they apparently have done is raise some concerns that they've spotted in Chinese on some Chinese internet sites that, the rest of us who don't speak Chinese wouldn't necessarily have access to, that there's an investment bank that claims that Peter Mandelson was in some way linked to it from a business, in a business capacity. Also remember that when Peter Mandelson, left government, he set up his own sort of advisory firm called Global Counsel. And back in 2013, 2015, these organisations did a lot of work with China. But what I would counter, though, here, irrespective of what's in this dossier, what I would counter is that, David Cameron, the former British Prime Minister, was drinking pints with Xi Jinping in pubs in 2015, and that was all front and centre out there, this great era of golden Sino-British relations. So whatever it is that they appear to have in this document, I question whether or not it's as fiery as they claim.
There's also the assumption when you leave government that you go off to be a private citizen. And I think the great surprise is the amount of involvement that Peter Mandelson has now had in the return of the Labour government. And so I think that raises questions as to when you leave government, when you've gone on to pastures new, do you forevermore have to adhere to the parliamentary standards which bound you when you were in office there?
Well, there's two things, isn't there? There's obviously, official regulators that say you have to sit it out for a little bit. And then there's obviously the court of public opinion, which is what this is about. But I would argue that, Tony Blair and Peter Mandelson in those days of New Labour were so instrumental to creating a more centrist version of the Labour Party and economic prescriptions for a country that was facing a very similar malaise to what we're facing now back in the 1990s. They were so crucial in that I think that they never really gave up the dream of coming back into government or being able to influence policy. And the same applies to Tony Blair and his global initiative as well, I'd say.
Let's look at a story that you spotted in The Guardian about the Chinese AI chatbot DeepSeek, which sent everyone into a tizzy about 2 or 3 days ago. Journalists have now played around with it, haven't they, to find out actually what it does?
That's right, journalists, and including a very avid reader of The Guardian. His name is, I think, Salvador, over in Mexico, who apparently started testing this DeepSeek AI chatbot with all sorts of questions that would be unpalatable to Beijing, the types of questions that, for instance, IPAC, the Interparliamentary Alliance on China, would like to see Beijing be more forthcoming on. So this reader of The Guardian started asking, what about the famous tank man who stood up to the army in Tiananmen Square? What about him? And apparently originally this chatbot that obviously has been training itself on lots of Western literature about this started saying, well, look, this is the symbol of bravery, courage and freedom. And then as it started answering, it started censoring itself in real time. And then it did the same sort of thing when asked other questions about whether or not Taiwan should maintain its independence. And I suppose the point here is that we talk a lot about how free speech must be protected at all costs, that we can't allow ourselves to lose the ability to speak freely. But what this speaks to is not getting a chance to get access to the information at all, because this new DeepSeek technology is actually only still sort of training itself. So if it's already starting to censor itself, people will be very concerned if it takes a bigger prominence in our lives.
Finally, concerns of a different nature. Are we drinking illegal wine?
It depends which side of the channel you're on. So the Times has this interesting report, which actually looks in. I don't know why it's in the news section, though. I've got to point that out. It seems like more of a feature to me. But it's doing sort of profile of this young man who's inherited his family vineyard in the Rhône Valley down in the south of France. I think his name is Mr. Chapoutier. And he's deciding to try and create what he calls provocative wines. So he wants to blend grapes coming from... all wine becomes a bit provocative after you've had a bit too much, doesn't it? Let's face it. Yeah, only the French would come up with something like that, a provocative wine, rather than an evocative wine. But apparently he wants to blend grapes coming from Australia and other sort of New World varieties with European grapes. And this is totally verboten on the other side of the channel because of EU rules and regulations. But he spies a new market here in the UK because now that we're no longer beholden to all that quote-unquote red tape from Brussels, we can drink blended wines, but there's some question marks over whether or not this is a niche market and will really take off. I do love the fact that Charlie Parker, actually, the news reporter in the Times, who I've actually written a couple of pieces with in the past, has called this terroirism. There you go, enological terroirism.
We'll leave it right there. Nino dos Santos, thank you so much for joining me in the studio. The time here in London is 7:32 a.m. You're listening to The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. A look now at what else we're keeping an eye on today. The Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni has been placed under investigation after a Libyan citizen wanted for war crimes was released. Signora Meloni says she's suspected of embezzlement and aiding and abetting a crime. NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte has urged members to strengthen its defences in the Arctic. He was speaking after a meeting with Denmark's Prime Minister, where they discussed Donald Trump's desire to take over Greenland. Rwandan-backed rebels have made rapid gains in the east of the Democratic Republic of Congo. There are reports that hundreds of people have been shot, with the UN warning that hospitals are overwhelmed. And 10 months after its long-delayed first subsonic flight, Boom Supersonic's prototype test plane, the XB-1, has broken the sound barrier. It becomes the first civil aircraft independently constructed that's ever flown supersonic. Boom wants to eventually build an airline that carries 64 passengers on supersonic international flights at Mach 1.7, similar to the service that Concorde offered. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. 7:33 here in London. Now, for those worried about what the Chinese Year of the Snake, which begins today, may bring, well, the advice is to wear red for protection. The most potent items of red clothing are apparently socks and underpants. But Thailand's tourism sector could probably do with something slightly more powerful than a few pairs of scarlet knickers to see it through the next few months. Chinese tourists are being scared away by fears over security. To tell us more, I'm joined now by James Chambers, Monocle's Asia editor based in Bangkok, and from Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia is the journalist Dave Grunebaum. A very good afternoon, good morning to you both.
Great to be here.
Dave, we'll begin with you. This is an issue, isn't it? That I was slightly flippant when I talked about protection by wearing red clothing, because this is a very serious business, isn't it?
It is. What's basically happening in this case, and why the Chinese people are getting scared away. The most recent incident was a Chinese actor, Wang Xing. He was lured into thinking that he had a casting tryout in Thailand. He flew to Thailand and then ended up being trafficked into Myanmar, where he was put into a scam compound and forced to be a scammer. And it's not just him. This has been happening to victims from across Asia. They fall for these job scam traps, usually not for acting. It could be for a variety of fields, with what seems to be very legitimate job opportunities. They're submitting their resumes. They often have Zoom interviews. The job offer is supposedly in Thailand. They get flown to Thailand and picked up in Bangkok and then trafficked over the border. And they're basically taught and forced to scam people from around the world to invest their money into what turn out to be cryptocurrency scams. It's very profitable for the gangsters behind this, most of whom originate from mainland China. It's very profitable for them. According to the UN, they're scamming people to the tunes of tens of billions of dollars a year. And the number of people who are trapped in these compounds, and these compounds that are in Myanmar, Cambodia, and Laos, according to the UN, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people, as difficult as it is to believe, that are trapped in these compounds.
James, let's bring you in on this one. These stories of scammers and these compounds, what effect is that having on Thailand?
Yeah, as Dave quite rightly said, I mean, these scam complexes are being run by, mainland Chinese gangsters. So it's Chinese trying to scam Chinese. And the unfortunate thing is Thailand's kind of caught in the middle because it's often a transit country. They fly in to Thailand and then get taken to Myanmar across the border. And when this famous, well, actually he's not that famous, but when this actor got disappeared, and one of his more famous friends made a big deal of it on Chinese social media, he was quickly found and returned to China. But it did spook tourists in China who had booked trips to Thailand for the Spring Festival, which, as you said, just kicked off this week. But this is a case of, multiple things can be true at the same time. There were, cancellations. Hotels in Bangkok and around Thailand did see Chinese tourists cancel. But, I mean, the bigger story is that Chinese visits to Thailand during this Spring Festival will be 20% higher than they were last year. So, I mean, it's a case of some people who were a bit timid aren't going to come, but actually overall, many more people are going to be coming this year than came last year. So I guess my advice would be, if you've had a dodgy email or text from someone offering you a job in Myanmar or Thailand that's perhaps too good to be true, it's best you probably stay at home.
Dave, bringing you back in Kuala Lumpur, tell us a little bit more about these cancellations of trips to Thailand by Chinese tourists. What is that doing for the likes of where you are?
Well, Malaysia, it's really interesting because on one hand, some of these people who had booked trips to go to Thailand from China, sometimes it's just one country, Thailand. Sometimes it's multi-country tours. They go to Thailand for a few days, then to Malaysia for a few days, then to Singapore for a few days. In some cases, people would just cancel the whole trip. So at one point, Malaysia was seeing some drop-off suddenly. But what was happening was then the tour operators here in Malaysia were calling their counterparts in China, saying, look, we've got lots of room here. People still want to come. They were not trying to tell people at all to cancel their trips to Thailand. They weren't trying to do that, but they're just saying, if you have people who want to book trips, we've got room. And I've spoken to hotel operators in some of the different, cities here, Penang, Kuching, Kota Kinabalu. They say the number of late bookings that they saw from mainland China just in these past few weeks, the sudden surge, they can say it can only be attributable to people choosing to come to Malaysia instead of going elsewhere. They say they always get last minute bookings, but it's been particularly high from mainland China, a way higher percentage than they'd seen in any year in the past. They say they can only attribute it to this.
And back in Bangkok, James, what efforts are you seeing in Thailand to ensure that the Chinese tourists, who are such an essential part of the Thai economy, actually do come back?
I think, as Dave said, this surge is real, and it's not just Malaysia that's seeing it. Thailand, as I've mentioned, has seen it this week. But I think, whereas there might be some hoteliers in Malaysia that have their own views, what I hear from hotel people in Bangkok and Hong Kong is that this is just the changing nature of Chinese tourists. They are traveling differently this time, these days. We're not seeing the big tour groups that we used to see in as many numbers. Chinese people are more, they're much more ready to go out on their own and travel independently. And as part of that, they are waiting to the last minute to try and get deals. And that's something that, when I was last in Hong Kong, I was hearing from some of the big hotels tell us that that's just the nature of the game these days. They can be very quiet right up until the last week, and then suddenly they get this surge of bookings from Chinese people who are trying to get the best deal. So, I mean, it's one of those things, there are many causes of this, but it does seem like, Malaysia, Thailand, Japan are seeing far more Chinese tourists than last year. We're still not to the pre-COVID levels, but Chinese tourism isn't going away. I guess the one thing, I would say from being on the ground here in Thailand is that every time we have a big Chinese festival, there seems to be some big news that comes up and we have this headline about Chinese tourists not coming. They still come. But Thailand is dealing with a huge, potentially existential issue with the smog here. I mean, over the last few weeks, the PM 2.5 has been through the roof. And if you live in Bangkok, you've not been going outside. I mean, my kids have been going crazy because we've been keeping them indoors. And that's something that the tourists haven't clocked yet. But it's something that the government is looking at very closely. And they've been pushing through these, emergency budgets to try and fix this problem before it really does damage Thailand's, biggest and most important industry. I walk around Bangkok seeing all these tourists enjoying, the weather. And I kind of think, well, they're sitting poolside having a great time. But, everyone who lives here is actually, hiding indoors with the air purifiers on.
James Chambers in Bangkok and Dave Grunebaum in Kuala Lumpur. Thank you both for joining us on Monocle Radio. You're listening to The Globalist. 8:41 a.m. in Zurich. Now, what does it mean to be a religious nationalist, and how much do citizens around the world want religion to inform how their leaders govern? Pew Research in the United States has just released a survey spanning 30 countries, which tries to establish what people think of the part religion plays in politics. Well, Monocle's Chris Chermak heard from Pew's senior researcher Jonathan Evans and began by asking him how the group went about defining religious nationalism for such a broad cross-section of countries.
There's a lot of different definitions of religious nationalism, and there's lots of country-specific examples where people have built maybe a scale or used a set of questions to define in a very hyper-localized context what it means in a specific country based on the policy debates or the structure of government. But our goal in this was to get a measure that would have relevance across cultures so that we could talk about it in the United States and Australia and Japan and Kenya. And so we chose these four measures that really look at two strains. So the first strain is looking at the intersection of the religious identity and the national identity. So we asked the question, how important is it to be, and then depending on the country, Christian or Buddhist or what have you, to be truly American or Thai? So what is the intersection between religion and national identity? And then this other strain of religious nationalism, looking at the intersection of religion and the political sphere itself, the governance. So how important is it for your national leader, whether that was the president or the prime minister, to share your religious beliefs? How much influence do you think the historically predominant religion in your society, its sacred texts, so the Bible or the Quran, how much influence do you think that should have on the laws of your country? And then for people who said it should have at least some influence on the country's law, we asked the follow-up of if there's a conflict between the religious text and the will of the people, which should have more influence in the laws in the country.
One of the interesting aspects that came out of this was when you look at the United States, because it polled pretty high on some of these individual elements, particularly, say, the role that the Bible does or should play in politics, but they weren't religious nationalists overall. Tell us about that.
Yeah, this various aspects of religious nationalism in the United States, we've asked about a few times in recent years. And as you point out, on individual measures, you might see elevated shares. So in 2022, we asked about if the United States should be a Christian nation, and upwards of more than 40% of adults said the country should be a Christian nation. But that was a much broader question, and we were on that survey a few years ago able to ask people, what is it, with an open-ended question, like what does it mean to be a Christian nation? And we saw a variety of answers. It does not mean a single unified thing to people. And so we knew we could not go out into the world and just ask, are you in favor of Christian nationalism, or are you in favor of Buddhist nationalism, or favorability towards those things, because it means so many different things to different people. Some people see it as, at least in the US, had seen it like the United States was founded at a time when there were lots of Christians in the society, and therefore like lots of the laws and beginnings were that way, or everything to people who say that there should be prayer in schools, or say that we should introduce more laws that deal with that intersection. And so knowing that there was that much variability within the United States on what people even thought a Christian nation was, we couldn't then ask that sort of question across 30 plus countries and hope to have things comparable. And so there is very much a chance that some of these measures or calculated shares who are classified as religious nationalists could be an undercount by some means, depending on the definition. So as you note, the US, only 6% of adults in this system would be classified as religious nationalists. I will point out, though, that in 2022 and 2024, we asked about Christian nationalism in the United States, and we saw that 5% of adults both times said they had a favorable view of the term. So it really depends on the measures that we use.
Well, it certainly depends on the measure, but in some other countries, there are very high levels of religious nationalists, and there are some pretty large differences across countries. And one particular I wanted to ask you about as well was in two Muslim nations that struck me. Turkey has by far among the lowest level of religious nationalists, around 11%, compared to, say, Indonesia, the world's largest Muslim nation, where almost half are seen or are considered religious nationalists. What was the difference for you there? Was it about sort of a tradition of secularism or something else that came through?
So another question we asked on the survey was if among Muslims in those countries and a few others that have larger Muslim populations, we did ask Muslims if they favor or oppose making Sharia the official law for Muslims in their country. And we saw that majorities in Malaysia, Bangladesh, Indonesia, saying that they favor making Sharia the official law for Muslims within their country, whereas in Turkey, a majority of Muslims said that they oppose making Sharia the official law for Muslims in Turkey.
There was another aspect of this, the idea of whether religion and democracy works together well. Tell us about that dynamic, because being a religious nationalist did not necessarily mean that you were opposed to democracy.
So in, again, several countries with large Muslim populations and in Israel, we asked if people in the countries thought that their country could be both, either Muslim or Jewish, and a democratic state. And for example, in Israel, almost 3/4 of adults in Israel say that their country can be both a Jewish state and a democratic state. Though looking at the share of adults in Israel who would be classified as religious nationalists, it is 9% of adults in Israel.
Jonathan Evans there of the Pew Research in Washington, speaking to Monocle's Chris Cermak. You're listening to The Globalist.
UBS is a global financial services firm with over 150 years of heritage. Built on the unique dedication of our people, we bring fresh thinking and perspective to our work. We know that it takes a marriage of intelligence and heart to create lasting value for our clients. It's about having the right ideas, of course, but also about having one of the most accomplished systems and an unrivaled network of global experts. That's why at UBS, we pride ourselves on thinking smarter to make a real difference. Tune in to The Bulletin with UBS every week for the latest insights and opinions from UBS all around the world.
7:47 here in London. Time now to talk trade and economy with Vicky Price, economist and former joint head of the UK government's Economic Service. Welcome back, Vicky. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Let us begin with the announcement by the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, about growth. And one of the big things she's focusing on is airports. Heathrow is back up at the top of the headlines again. The third runway returns to the columns. What's happening?
Yes, well, there's going to be a speech later on today, which is going to be covering all that, because, of course, the push for the Chancellor is to find reasons to be optimistic. And one of the things that she's pushing is infrastructure spending. And, of course, Heathrow has been talked about and decided upon, and then nothing happened a number of times. So it's not a short-term project, but it does have loads and loads of costs attached to it. So we're talking about a third runway in one of the most expensive locations in in the UK, which is going to cause huge disruption for transport. The M25, which is the motorway around it, bits of it will have to disappear and become a tunnel, and so that the runway can expand. If indeed those are the plans that are going to be going ahead, there could be a slightly diminished plan, perhaps, that is going to be put forward. But there are also going to be expansions in other airports. The expectation is that there will be an announcement that the plans for Gatwick to have another one will go through, and there's Luton expanding. We've already had City Airport and Stansted being given permission to do something there as well. So we're talking about increasing airport capacity in the UK quite significantly. The problem with all that is that, yes, for some of the smaller airports, you can do things reasonably quickly and the money is already sort of more or less available. Heathrow will take a long time, and I think it is more the optics showing that the UK is really intent on getting growth done. It's really going to be, in the future, as it is now, an international hub, attracting a lot of investment, loads of passengers, and also, showing that it is really open for business. And I think that is desperately needed by the Labour government right now. We're at a time when businesses have generally voted everything they've done so far down, and with a lot of pessimism around.
Just looking at the way that an expansion of Heathrow would position it internationally, I mean, at the moment we have Charles de Gaulle, Schiphol and Frankfurt all snapping at Heathrow's heels. Does Heathrow absolutely need this to ensure survival and growth?
Well, a third runway would increase the position of, or improve the position of Heathrow hugely by comparison to the other places, including Frankfurt and Charles de Gaulle, of course. And so it will be quite a substantial move upwards for it. I mean, the truth is that quite a lot of other airports across the world and in Europe are building more runways and are intending to cope with the increase in demand for aviation that we're seeing. So yes, there are loads and loads of environmental concerns. So the likelihood is that anything that happens is going to be delayed quite significantly, and the net zero commitments that everyone is making. But it looks like we're sort of moving into a new era, maybe influenced by President Trump, of perhaps caring a little bit less about the environment. Yes, people are saying that aviation fuel is going to be a lot more environmentally friendly. Airplanes are being built differently. The engines are different, so it's all going to be really fine, and they don't make so much noise any longer. But nevertheless, what we seem to be moving towards is having growth above green. And if you look at Europe and how it's moving as well, it's worrying about competitiveness. I think there is deregulation, if you like, in the air, and quite a lot of political pressures, particularly from right-wing parties in Europe, to also worry less about the environment. But yes, I think Heathrow will need it, does need it, and has been arguing the case and has been approved. The question is how it's going to be paid, how much it's going to cost, and what other guarantees will the government give to Heathrow for it to be able to get the money together and to go ahead with building it, because only the infrastructure will be paid for by the government, one assumes, but the rest of it will be paid privately.
Vicky Price, thank you as ever for joining us on Monocle Radio. You're listening to The Globalist, and listening to that was our chairman and editorial director, Tyler Bruno, who I'm delighted to say joins me now. Very good morning to you, Tyler. How good to see you in the studio.
Good morning, Emma.
How's life?
Very good. How's life with you?
Oh, fine. Absolutely fine.
We got the corduroy memo this morning,
which
is good. So listeners, Emma is just, it's a beautiful belted shirt dress in a lovely Loden. I'm wearing trousers to match.
It's wonderful. Thank you so much for the compliment. I shall take it. Tell us a little bit about your reaction to that comment from Vicky Price about how Heathrow does need it, will need it to expand. But we've been talking about Heathrow since... I can't remember.
Well before this program launched about this third runway. And I think there is a fatigue, there's a skepticism. Is it going to happen? There's going to be a lot of political energy. There's going to be a lot of money spent on a whole new round of feasibility studies, because, of course, you can imagine the ones that only are just fresh off the printer are outdated now. And, of course, as was highlighted, there's, of course, changes in engine technology. Aircraft are quieter, will get quieter. How is that going to impact? You're going to get a push from the side to say, well, what will that mean in terms of, even can Heathrow also expand to later hours? A variety of things. And I think, what has to happen is we also have to look at some very simple measures now. We know it's going to take a lot of will to, of course, get the diggers out, the excavators to make this happen. Why don't we look at some other things as well when you think about the hubs that this city is competing with have airports that are running around the clock, or if they're running beyond midnight, they're still open. And I think this is something which we have to look at. Say, maybe we should start with some small measures. If we want to compete with Doha, then probably we need to also have, at least at the very beginning, a rule book which matches, which allows aircraft to come in across the day.
And looking at what other countries are doing as well. I mean, the focus in France is very much, and you've just came off the Eurostar yesterday afternoon.
Yesterday, yeah.
What are the French focusing on here at the moment? Because they're all trains now, aren't they? There's still a sort of aviation is a bogeyman at the moment.
Well, it is, and this is, of course, is a challenge. You can talk to the chairman or CEO of Air France KLM. This is a huge issue. So I think the other side of it is you also have major hubs like Schiphol, for example, where you have the government fighting against whether this airport is should really function as an airport to be literally an engine for the Dutch economy. This is a headache because, of course, you have an alliance. One group, of course, as Air France KLM. So that's a challenge for the leadership there. And then, of course, if you look at the French story right now, let's rewind a couple of stories. I think just when you were talking to Nina and the things that are happening in this country where there's announcements we're going to get some new reservoirs in the UK, this third runway. What are the French doing? They're talking about the Louvre. We've just, had this, epic display of pageantry, all of that budget that was left over, of course, from the Olympics. I mean, how could there be any left for the French TV networks? Let's bring it to life, of course, with the reopening of the Louvre. I mean, with the reopening of Notre Dame. They went over budget at the end of the year to ensure they had enough money for 2025, or at least the coffers would be full as well. So, of course, they did an amazing New Year's Eve number. And now we've seen this announcement, of course, that the Louvre... we know there's bottlenecks. It's maybe well past much of its functioning life right now, and at least $1 billion has to be thrown at that.
It also does push a much more direct and rather more pleasant message that when you have Emmanuel Macron standing in front of the Mona Lisa, that's all you need to know. It's much easier than having, Keir Starmer in a reservoir.
Well, also, it's also much more, you could say, B2C. It's talking to an end consumer. It's talking to an end consumer, not just in France, but globally. It is sending out a global message. I don't know if a lot of people in Minneapolis or sitting in Manila are getting excited about that third runway at Heathrow.
We're getting excited about night trains, though, in Paris. So tell us.
We're getting excited about night trains in Europe because you spend a lot of time in Austria. We've seen ÖBB, of course, the Österreichische Bundesbahn, really taking a lead over the last few years with their night train services, their night jet service. And then we saw at the same time, actually, as they were ordering rolling stock, a lot of countries also cancelling their night trains. Well, everyone, of course, is back on track now. And we've seen the French make, it's a sort of a provisional announcement. It's a call, of course, it's a tender, and they want to get a number of services up and running. When you look at the numbers of that they're sort of looking at, it suggests that they're going to also be probably more aggressive than they were before, just running domestic services. So I would imagine that France Incorporated is going to want to see challenging and having trains running up to Copenhagen and many other places.
Finally, we have 1 minute to talk about the Paris Bureau.
We do. We could talk about the Paris Bureau. And there, I was there yesterday morning. Well, that's not the Bureau bit, but this is the space. I mean, it's on Rue Bachemont. This is where our cafe and our radio setup is going to be. My goodness, is it looking handsome. This studio, it's a decent size, but this has got volume. This is probably like twice the ceiling height. It's even got some natural daylight, which is also nice as well. It's a sliver, but this is coming together. Everyone is sort of, I would say, being pushed to see if we can be up running. At least for the show on the 9th of February, we'll be sitting in London doing the news, but we will be doing the show from there. It looks like we'll be... there's great news from, of course, all of the authorities in charge of high-speed internet yesterday. Big thumbs up yesterday afternoon that was all going to be installed by the end of this week. So I think we'll be able to broadcast.
Plugged in, up and running, and beautiful. And that's just the Paris Bureau. Yeah, that's Tyler Brûlé. Thank you so much for joining me in the studio. That's all the time we have for today's programme. The warmest of thanks to all my guests, and thanks too to the producers Chris Chermak and Tom Webb, our researcher Maisie Ringer, and our studio manager Steph Chungu. After the headlines, more music on the way. The briefing's live at midday here in London. The Globalist is back at the same time tomorrow. I hope you can join me for that if you can. But for now, from me, Emma Nelson, goodbye. Thank you very much for listening.